welcome to Thirunelly. Today we will be discussing current affairs of 29th of October 2022. So let's start with the first news of the day. The first news is about the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. According to the Prime Minister, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, it gives an impetus to the system in a decisive fight against terrorism. So that means the UAPA is an important law in India against the terrorism. So let's see some of the important provisions of this act. It was passed in the year 1967, and this act, it provides for a special procedures to deal with the terrorist activities. And so according to this act, any activity or conduct that would constitute a crime which will contravene the law, any conduct that occurred before or after the commencement of this act, whether such conduct occurred in the Republic or elsewhere. So anything which contravenes any law. So unlawful activity means something which is against the law. Alright, now the UAPA section 15 would define terrorist act and is punishable for the imprisonment for at least 5 years of life, and in case of the terrorist act, it would result in the death penalty, death or imprisonment for life. The act assigns the absolute power to the central government, by way of which the centre deems an activity as unlawful by an official gazette declared it so. That means if we go by this act, there will not be any particular definition of act, but according to the Supreme Court judgment, any conduct or act that basically inculcates the fear or terror in the population, that would amount as the act of terror. All right, so this article has been taken from the Hindu, and in mains also you can use this information in the government policies, laws, mechanism, and etc. The design and development of the policies and the issues arising out of it. The next news of the day is about the Wayanad farmer creates Ashoka Chakra using paddy art. Now this paddy art, which is also known as the tombow art, is a very famous art originating in the country of Japan. Now what happens, the farmers in Japan, they use different varieties of rice, different varieties of flowers to create designs on the land. So for example, if design has to be created, some certain variety of paddy will be sown here, some variety of paddy will be sown here, certain flowers will be sown here in order to make patterns and design. So this was a rice paddy art which was developed by the farmers of the Inakade village in Japan about a decade ago, and the similar technique has been used by the Wayanad farmer named Thirunelly Sree Mahavishnu around this temple by a person named Johnson Oliappuram. So this can be a prelims question, that tambow art is related to what? Basically, tambow art is a paddy art in which the paddies, different varieties are grown, their different varieties are sown in order to create pattern on the land. The source is the Hindu. The third news of the day is about human trafficking in the valley of Kashmir. So 14 women, including minors, they were rescued from the gang of traffickers, including 2 women from the central Kashmir's Budgam on Friday. Now if we look at the main point of this, that human trafficking according to the Article 23 is prohibited. And what do we mean by human trafficking? Human trafficking means sale and purchase of human as commodity. So this is the meaning of human trafficking, and according to Article 23 it is prohibited. So the Article 23 says the traffic in human beings and the begar and other similar forms of forced labor are prohibited, and any contravention of this provision shall be an offence punishable in accordance with the law. Article 23 protects the citizen not only against the law but also against the private citizens. The state is obligated to protect the citizen from these evil and take punitive action against the perpetrator. According to Article 35, which empowers the Indian Parliament to create special laws in order to enforce certain of the fundamental rights. Therefore, in accordance with the Article 35, the Indian Parliament had legislated one law with respect to the human trafficking, that is Prevention of the Human Trafficking and Rehabilitation Act of 2019, and its amendments thereafter. So human trafficking, we have understood the meaning of human trafficking, and human trafficking can be for various purposes, for the purpose of sexual exploitation, for the extraction of organs, for the bonded labor, for forced labor, for sexual slavery, and modern form of slavery. Now, what is this modern form of slavery? Earlier, when slavery was prevalent during the middle time and during the ancient time also in certain parts of the world, when slavery and also during the modern times, during the colonial period when slavery was prevalent, slaves, they did not had any right. They were not even considered as human, and they were subordinate to their masters with respect to all their decisions throughout their life. However, in the form of modern slavery means a person is particularly forced into certain conditions because due to their circumstances. For example, a person is working in a factory, but the person lacks the bargaining power and the person is working way below the minimum wage. So that is a kind of a modern slavery. Modern human trafficking is also responsible for the modern slavery. Now let's move on to the next news of the day. The next news is about the high inflation, which is a result of the exogenous price shock. Now, the high inflation which has been observed in the last quarter of the year, it has been mainly due to the exogenous price shock. Now, what does this exogenous price shock? Exo means something which is outer, matlab means something which is outside. So that means most of the factors which are responsible for high inflation in the country are exogenous, are the external factors. For example, the Russia-Ukraine war, the pandemic was also the reason. The supply chain blockage was the reason. The oil prices is also the reason. So the food inflation, especially if I take the example of the edible oil, then the inflation which was observed in the food sector, specifically in the edible oil sector, then it was due to this Russia-Ukraine war, because Ukraine is one of the largest exporter of the sunflower oil. So if we consider all these factors, then these are all external factors. Therefore, the high inflation is mainly due to the exogenous price shock, the external factors which are responsible for high inflation in the country. And there is one more term which is also known as the import of inflation. Import of inflation. That means the commodities which the country is importing are at higher prices because of all these factors that I have just discussed. So therefore, the term exogenous price shock can also be correlated with the import of the inflation. Now let's look at some of the important points from this news which has been taken from the Hindu. The high inflation rate which was observed in the second quarter of the financial year of 2022 and 23 as compared with the previous two quarters was the result of the high fuel and food prices and their spillover effect on other sectors which sustained the high inflation rate. So if we talk about the retail CPI inflation, that is consumer price index retail, it remained above 6% since January 2022 and it was 7.41% in September. It is also important to take measures to limit the spillover of the price shocks to the rest of the country. let's move on to the fifth news of the day. The panel raises data privacy concern in the draft telecom bill. In one of our editorial discussion, we comprehensively had discussed the draft telecommunication bill, and now the data privacy has also been one of the concern, which was also one of the issues we had discussed in our editorial discussion. So you can go to the playlist and watch that particular editorial in which we have discussed the telecommunication bill and it concerns that arises from there. Now what happened, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information and Technology, it has raised several questions and the implication of the new telecommunication bill on the data privacy. Now if you remember that in India we do not have any particular law dealing with the data privacy. The privacy protection bill has been pending in the parliament for almost for years now, after the recommendation of the Justice B.N. Sree Krishna committee in the Justice B.N. Sree Krishna committee. So the Parliamentary Standing Committee has raised concern with respect to the definition of the public interest and the national security. The telecommunication bill had talked about the interception of the connection as and when required in the public interest and the national security. The committee says that these two terms are vague in nature. The definition are vague, and therefore holistic comprehensive deliberations are needed when it comes to curtailing the freedom of speech and expression on account of public interest and national security. Now let's look at the highlights of the draft bill, for detail you can watch the editorial. The bill basically consolidates the three acts, which was the first major point we had discussed. It is the Indian Telegraph Act, the Indian Wireless Telegraphy Act, and the Telegraph Wireless Unlawful Protection Act of 1950. These three acts are to be consolidated into one act that would be formed if the new bill is passed by the parliament and if it would be given assent by the president. So let's look at the another provision, that is the dilution of the TRAI power. TRAI is a regulatory body, and the new bill is going to dilute the power of the TRAI in terms of its regulation, in terms of asking for information from the government of India, and also in terms of refurnishing information to the government of India when it comes to the spectrum allocation and spectrum bidding. So the power of the TRAI has also been diluted in terms of issuing new license to the service provider, and these are some of the crucial responsibilities and that TRAI had played over the years since its establishment, since the 1990s. Now let's talk about the OTT regulation. Now, one of the major concerns that the traditional service provider had raised was that the OTT platforms such as the WhatsApp, Google Meet, FaceTime, etc., they were not under the ambit of the strict regulation as the traditional service providers were. However, they also provided the similar services as provided by the internet service provider and the traditional telecommunication service providers such as Airtel, Idea, Vodafone, etc. So there was no level playing field between these two, and loss of revenue occurred to the traditional service provider because people had now shifted to messaging and video calling via these OTT platforms. So therefore the third provision, a very important provision that the telecommunication bill made, was that these OTT platforms will come under the regulation, and they would also be needing licenses to offer the services as needed by the other service providers so far. So these are some of the three important points that we had discussed in detail in our editorials, and I have given a brief overview here too. So there is a provision for refund also. Now, if the telecom ministry, in case the internet service provider or the telecom service provider surrenders his license, then there is also a provision for the refund of the fees. Default in payment by licenses. In the event of payment default and in the extraordinary circumstances, including the financial stress, the consumer interest, and maintaining maintenance of the competition in the sector, reliability, the continued supply of the telecommunication services, etc., the government can defer the payment of such amounts, convert a part of all of the amounts payable into shares, write off the payable amount, or provide relief from the payment, etc. And in case of the insolvency, these are some of the other points that I am discussing here. You can add it to the editorial discussion. In case of the insolvency, what happens? The spectrum which is assigned to an entity, it shall be revert to the government control, and the central government would decide what further action would be taken in such cases. So the source was the Hindu. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching Tarunayas. Have a nice day.